Shut It All Down movement really started in response to sort of a global and national observation of increasing femicide. So Shut It All Down, I insist, is a youth-led organic movement which started and continued because of young Namibian people who insisted on demonstrating a national intolerance to gender-based violence and femicide. So the way it started initially was in specific response to an incident in which you had the late Shannon Basserval, may her soul rest in peace, who had essentially gone missing in 2020. And, there was kind of this national hope that Shannon would eventually return. So when a headline emerged in the national newspaper in the Namibian about Shannon's remains being found in the desert, that pushed Namibians off the edge. So I always like to say also that it's important to ensure that in even honoring Shannon's memory, right? Shannon's not the poster child for gender-based violence in Namibia, but that was the specific incident for a sort of collective frustration that then eventually turned into Shut It All Down. So what had happened was then we saw that, and a friend of mine and I sat down the next day and we sort of asked, okay, well, what can we do? How can we respond? What can we do? And what we decided on was protest, because that's easily the most sort of natural way for young people to respond when you don't have an official platform, and for people who are incredibly frustrated. So we organized a protest and we sent out a couple of flyers to a couple of organizations, and we organized one of the biggest protests in Namibian history within a matter of 24 hours. And not because you were brilliant, which Namibian youth are, but largely because young Namibian people care, and young Namibian people are not, contrary to popular belief, despondent or apathetic to what's happening in the country. So that's how Shut It All Down started. So fast forward, the following day, you had just over, I think it was something like just over 800 young Namibians gathered in the central business district in the capital city of Windhoek to demonstrate. And the protest continued for 2 or 3 days after that. But that's really how Shut It All Down was birthed, is a frustration, and it was the energy of young people, and it was an understanding of our opportunity to do something, or at the very least to say something. I always say it's funny. And I always joke that Shut It All Down was being led by young broke people. So no, we did not have any formal organizational fancy tools. We had posters and we had water bottles and we had a secondhand car, and we had one person with a driver's license, and printers and computers to send emails. So there were no tools. And it's interesting because many times when we have this conversation about Shut It All Down, there is a question of, well, what is the secret? What did we do? And the truth is, all that we did was be honest about what we wanted, and we were sort of vulnerable as well, because with any kind of protest or with any kind of sharing of concern or frustration, you do take both an individual and collective risk that whoever you're speaking to won't care, or whoever you're speaking to won't listen. In our case, it was, the fear that the government, who our concerns were largely directed to, would not care or would not listen. So all we had, I think, was I wouldn't say fearlessness, because I personally, for instance, was afraid, but it was definitely an understanding of the cause being bigger than personal or individual fear. So I'd say that is the tool, honestly. It's more of an interpersonal tool than it is a practical one. But we did not have any out of the ordinary tools that were not emails and water bottles and computers. And I like to classify them into two. So we've definitely had the sort of discursive progress, which is conversation, which is a reaffirmation of the agency and the value of the contributions of young people. So those have been successes and they've all been great. But we have had concrete responses from government. And I'm going to read just some of them because I don't want to get them wrong. So some of the most important, crucial, and meaningful successes have been, so one, there's definitely been the Sexual Offenders Registry, which is something that we were petitioning for, which is, so the government, for instance, of Namibia had already commenced with working on a sex offenders registry, but that's an effort that's going to be accelerated in response to Shut It All Down protests. So there's also been the establishment of sexual and gender-based violence offences courts, right, where there's this court that has essentially been agreed upon, and whether or not that was already in the works or whether that was brought on by the protests, it's obviously an ongoing conversation, but it doesn't matter because the bottom line is there's the establishment of sexual and gender-based violence offences courts. So there's the review of sentencing laws for sex offenders, which is also something that we're calling for in the Shut It All Down petition. There's the expedition of current murder and sexual offences. There is the revocation of bail of current trial awaiting persons who are accused of sex offences for murder. And I think for me, my favorite sort of changes, they're not policy changes as such, but they are concrete successes, is the institution of 24/7 armed patrols, and the government continuing to mobilize more financial resources to train and sensitize first responders such as social workers and largely police officers, and also there's now a prohibition or an emerging prohibition of the withdrawal of any sexual and gender-based violence cases. There's concrete policy and governmental successes, and the list really goes on. But definitely, there have been concrete successes that we're proud of, and that we probably will not see the fruits of right now, but that we will be holding government accountable to in the near future. So the difference really is almost very natural as well, because the way the movement started was in many ways spontaneous, and even the proportions to which it grew were highly, highly unexpected. So from the onset, I remember thinking, oh my goodness, I think we've created a monster. And the exponential, almost unnatural growth of Shut It All Down in its early stages is unsustainable, just realistically. And I think that's largely because protesting is rooted in a certain amount of national shock value, which you can't sustain. So there's definitely a difference. So Shut It All Down was very much sort of protest oriented, but I think now we've sort of matured from the spontaneous protest, which obviously will always be inherent to the fabric and to the compositional nature of Shut It All Down. But now we've definitely grown, or are sort of growing into a more structured organization with more accountability mechanisms, with more structures, with more tools, and with a lot more intentionality about our intervention. So, for instance, that would mean a more refined understanding of the fact that we don't have to do things alone, that we can partner with other organizations, and wondering, for instance, where we can use our capacity in different ways to support existing efforts, and acknowledge also that that is meaningful work in itself. So also because Shut It All Down's growth had been so exponential, that had meant that there was no time to sit down and say, okay, this is our chairperson and this is our, we don't have a leader and we don't have your sort of formal organizational structure necessarily. So that the way that has impacted our work means that we've now grown into an organization that is almost composed of really just young people providing their time and who care for a certain cause. But that has also meant that we needed to get, for practical reasons, we've needed to get creative with our work, and with largely supporting existing efforts with the capacity that Shut It All Down has in different ways. Young women specifically who are at the forefront or who are just heavily engaged in any movement is that it is crucially important to be intentional about balancing how much of yourself you put into the movement. So, from my personal experience, and I am being sort of very frank here, is I had found that I was not prepared for the degree of self investment that I needed to practice into Shut It All Down. So I was underprepared, entirely unprepared for the fact that I would need to preserve myself while giving the best of myself to this movement and to this cause that I really wanted. So I needed to sort of compartmentalize my passion and care for the cause with my own instinct to self-preserve, and with a remembrance that I'm not going to be everything to everyone, and that I'm doing my best, and that that is enough. And I think that's because at some point when it's such a big cause, you can get wrapped up in almost a version of grandeur and a version of self-delusion about, you know, how much of you is needed to keep this thing going, right? So I needed, for instance, to remind myself the movement will not stop, the cause will not stop, people will not stop fighting if I rest, people will not stop fighting if I develop another interest, people will not stop fighting if I choose to breathe and to preserve myself instead. So I really wish I had known that before I had gotten involved. And I wish I had also known to not give in to the sort of demands on my character that might have been unrealistic.